Hello, and thank you for watching our video. My name is Loris.
My name is Isaiah.
My name is Emily.
And I'm Allison.
And we will be giving a presentation on an article called Development and Validation of the Cultural Competence Assessment Instrument, a Factorial Analysis. To begin, the U.S. is becoming increasingly more diverse, and as that diverse population increases, so do the amount of people with chronic health conditions and disabilities. These people with chronic health conditions and disabilities need healthcare professionals and practitioners to help them live with their disability and to be able to integrate into society. This was a big reason why the experimenters thought it was important to create a cultural competence assessment in order to assess the people who will be helping the disabled and the chronically ill integrate into society and be able to live with their disability. This article revolves around disability, so it's important to have a definition and to know what that means. So a disability is a physical or mental condition that limits your movements, your activities, or your senses. So this is just something to keep in mind when listening to the rest of our presentation. Cultural competence is important when interacting with the disabled. Unfortunately, it lacks a unified definition, but the best comes from a nursing professional program. And their definition is, cultural competence is when practitioners understand and appreciate differences in health beliefs, respects variation within different cultural groups, and is able to adjust his or her practice to accommodate them. Also, an important note to note about cultural competence is that it doesn't happen quickly, but over time with constant exposure to cultural groups, so just something to keep in mind. So one of the biggest challenges regarding cultural competence is how to measure it. There are some assessments, but none have been validated by healthcare professionals or practitioners, the ones who will be using the assessment the most. You may ask why this is important. This is important because if disability is increasing in the United States, we need healthcare professionals and practitioners to be able to accommodate them, help them with what they need, and be able to integrate them into society. There is a lack of cultural competence regarding the disabled, but this article describes and kind of creates an assessment instrument that is designed to measure cultural competence among healthcare professionals and practitioners, the ones who will benefit the most from using the test and being able to implement it for the best of the disabled.
So the method of this study was basically divided into two separate parts. The first was the development of the Cultural Competence Assessment Instrument, and the second was a section on the participants themselves. So during the development of the Cultural Competence Assessment Instrument, or the CCAI, they basically broke this down into 5 different steps. The first was they conducted a literature review of 259 different peer-reviewed articles basically about either cultural competence or a measurement of cultural competence. The second step was they did a factor analysis of these different models and ended up identifying 4 major factors. This was cultural awareness, which basically means developing a critical view of different cultural differences or people's experiences of oppression. The second was cultural knowledge, which is referring to the cultural practice of specific racial or ethnic groups. The third was cultural skills, which is developing professional practices and behaviors designed to better communicate with people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. And the third was cultural practice, which is basically about going into the world and experiencing diversity and acknowledging the pros and cons of it. The third step was identifying key areas and developing questions to assess each of these 4 factors. They did this by developing some of their own questions and also incorporating questions from other people's models that were already created. The fourth step was they then tested these questions among a panel of experts who provided feedback on a 1 to 4 scale of how successful these were in measuring the different factors. And the fifth step was they actually gave this survey to different participants, and then received feedback and revised it once more. The second section was on the participants. As you can see, the American Occupational Therapy Association provided a list of which they randomly generated 1,000 different names. They then sent their survey to these 1,000 participants along with the goals of this survey and a $1 incentive. 477 participants ended up sending the survey back to them, which was 47.7%.
Okay, so in regards to analyzing the data, they performed two forms of factor analyses, and factor analyses are just used to determine clumps of variables that can then be called factors. They're the latent variables in a study. So in general, they use the exploratory factor analysis as well as a confirmatory factor analysis to confirm the validation of the instrument, that the instrument was measuring what they wanted it to measure. And so they did this in a three-step process. So first they performed the exploratory factor analysis, and this just told them about the dimensionality of their measure. EFAs are used to look for correlations, and then from these correlations they can create those large factors, and then the researchers can assign names to those factors. From there, they refined the factorial solution, so they got rid of items that didn't really align with the factor that they got put into or didn't add to the internal validity and consistency of what they were looking for, or didn't load into a factor very well. And this idea of an item loading into a factor is just that it fits into the factor well. And then they performed a confirmatory factor analysis, and this basically did the same thing as the exploratory factor analysis, but in the opposite direction. So it just confirmed what they thought the measure was testing and looking at. And so in regards to their results, they did some demographic statistical analyses just to determine what kind of population they were looking at. And so they determined that their population was 91% white, 94% female, and the mean age was 43.3. And so what they determined is that the group of people they were looking at were primarily practitioners who were female, white, and middle-aged. But they did confirm that all of those who had responded to their surveys were, in fact, individuals who were working with those with disabilities, whether it was children, youth, or adults. And so when they first performed the exploratory factor analysis, they came up with these 4 factors. And so the first factor was awareness, and this is the idea that the practitioners can feel that they learn from their ethnic minority clients. The second was this idea of knowledge seeking, and knowledge seeking expressed ideas such as, I learn about different ethnic cultures through educational methods and or life experiences. The third factor they found was skills, and skills was this idea that they can be effective in verbal communication or just communication in general with clients whose culture was different than theirs. And then they came up with the last idea of organizational support, and this expressed ideas that cultural competence is included in their workplace's mission statement, practices, and procedures. And then they performed some analyses and determined that this factor analysis could have actually been expressed more parsimoniously. So that's just the idea that it could have been expressed more simply. And so they ran a secondary factor analysis and determined that they could get rid of the knowledge-seeking factor. So they had 3 major factors that they found from the exploratory factor analysis of awareness, skills, and organizational support. So from there they did that fine-tuning process and then ran that confirmatory factor analysis. And that confirmatory factor analysis confirmed what they thought about what they were measuring in their instrument, and it validated what had been expressed in the EFA, and it fit what they wanted it to fit well without being redundant or having unnecessary items involved in it.
Okay, so starting with this discussion, I'd like to do a recap of the study. So as previously stated, the study was done to develop and validate a measure for a cultural competency in rehabilitation settings. With this in mind, they conducted 2 exploratory factor analyses and 1 confirmatory factor analysis to form a model for the instrument to follow. The results of the results of these analyses were a 3-factor model with the following components: cultural awareness, cultural skills, and organizational support. And as previously stated in the results, the psychometric data supported these 3 factors. So researchers wanted to place an emphasis on the difficulty in developing the scale. Initially, they began with a 4-factor model, but after reviewing the data, they saw that a 3-factor model fit better. In support of this, results supported the 3-component view into three key factors. The key factors were cognitive, which related to cultural awareness, behavioral, which related to cultural practices, and contextual, which related to organizational support. Authors also believe that cultural knowledge wasn't necessarily an independent factor in cultural competency because it didn't actually assess the specific diversity information that rehabilitation practitioners would know. Due to researchers having to switch from a 4 model to a 3 model, they found support in the difficulty and complexity of cultural competency. So an interesting or important find in this study was that organizational support emerged as a distinct and critical factor of cultural competency. This finding is interesting because previously validated scales did not include cultural competency in their scales at all. However, this research showed that employees generally want to do an effective culturally competent service delivery, but they need the support of organizations to follow through on them. Given the strong correlations between organizational support, cultural skills, and cultural awareness, and organizational support seems like an important factor in determining cultural competency in individual practitioners. So next, the limitations. The limitations boil down to generalizability. All participants in this study were occupational therapy clinicians, so there's a fear that the study may not apply to all rehabilitation practitioners. However, authors also noted that the participant pool was diverse in the people they treat in terms of race, lifespan, and diversity, or disability, rather. And so for future research, authors suggested a further look into organizational practices that can either support or hinder culturally competent service delivery. Organizations generally go by a system of reimbursement to dictate their policies, which can inhibit innovation. So researchers would want further research into how practitioners can combat and recognize this in their workplace. So with that said, we'd like to thank you for watching our video.